This is going to be our first in a series of monthly webinars that we plan to do concerning common and best practices in Office 365. Today, specifically, we're going to be discussing the current threat and security landscape as it relates to most companies. I define most companies here because the mega organizations, Coca-Cola, GE, the multi-100,000 people enterprises, they have very different issues than the average companies. So we're going to be discussing problems as it relates to companies that aren't gigantic. And then we're going to spend up some time clearing up some common misconceptions that we've seen concerning the Microsoft Cloud, as well as covering some best practices, some easy tweaks and changes that can be implemented that will make the Office 365 instance much more secure with very little effort. So we're going to just jump into the discussion concerning the threat landscape for small businesses. And so logic dictates that a larger company would create and hold a larger reward for malicious actors. The issue with this, and attackers know this as well, is that large companies are more commonly very well secured because they've done the analysis and they know exactly how devastating a well-executed attack could be for them. This doesn't mean that they don't happen, and obviously when it does, it makes the news. But what ends up happening here is that this leaves other businesses as the most optimal target. 43% of cyber attacks are targeted towards smaller businesses. This number is disproportionately large, and it increases to over 50% if we include medium-sized businesses. These companies are targeted over larger entities for one reason, and that's because they're less likely to have secured themselves as a large enterprise, as well as a large enterprise. And this makes them an easier and more likely payoff for attackers. And we know that obviously the effects of a well-executed attack can be devastating, can absolutely cripple a business. On average, it costs $900,000 to recover from a successful cyber attack. And in some cases, this cost is enough to force a business to close their doors. And why attacks in general are just so devastating is that it's a surprise. By the time anyone realizes anything is happening, it's far too late. We're going to go ahead and we're going to open a poll real quick just to get a sense of experience get the experience of anyone and everyone in the room to discuss the idea of, are you concerned about a security or a data breach? I'm just going to we're going to go ahead and we're going to give it 30 seconds. And I think we'll go ahead and we'll call that 30. So thank you for the data on the poll. It does look like a good number of people are concerned about the idea of a security breach against their business. And in light of that, I do want to spend a couple minutes just breaking down why attacks themselves are so successful. But before we get too much into that, I do want to mention that being in the Microsoft Cloud specifically is the best first step that you've taken. In Office 365, you have options, you have an enterprise grade system, and that you have the ability to offload a lot of the management and security to someone else. Things like on-premise email servers, other non-enterprise, non-commercial systems tend to cause other challenges and other security vulnerabilities, and you are very much nipping that in the bud by being in Office 365. So we're going to go ahead and get into why ignorance is most certainly not bliss when it comes to cybersecurity in the cloud. And first and foremost, organizations themselves, with all of their email and data flowing in and out, that presents a very large attack vector. There are several just very low effort ways for an attacker to gain access. Most commonly, what we all see, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this, is just a slapdash email thrown together with all its spelling mistakes and poor grammar, make its way into a user's mailbox, claiming to be from a VIP within the company. And these messages are not rare. Attackers send out hundreds of thousands of these messages each day. And unfortunately, the math is very much in their favor because it only takes one recipient to ensure the bad actor has a very good day, which is why email is such a common entry point for attack. The bar is very low. Next most common is the user's password being compromised. Bizarrely, even in Microsoft Office 365, default settings for Office 365 is that passwords are never set to expire. Obviously, we don't recommend that. All passwords should expire on a regular basis. And then, so getting beyond this idea of emails being attacked and passwords being compromised, passwords being weak, 58% of the time, we see the users themselves leak information simply when asked. More often than not, it's a simple, well-crafted email, something without the spelling mistakes, without the grammar errors, or a smooth-talking person on the other end of a phone line pretending that they're someone that they're not. Smaller companies are a really big target because of the various methods of entry. We've kind of discussed everything here, but again, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to touch on email. Because everyone has it. Every business uses email. This means that attackers, if they want to weigh in, they have a way in to every business, and it's their email. There's literally no other tree that is as ripe for picking as email-based attacks. The average business has poor anti-spam protection. The average business has unsavvy users who will click on unsavory links and attachments. The average business has had users inadvertently send out data. It's a rarity, in fact, that a business hasn't experienced all three types of an email data breach. So you might be making notes here that I am focusing on users themselves being the ones sending out information, users themselves clicking on malicious links and attachments, and that's because users are a huge liability. Just as they're there, just the average human. So when we start to pair them with devices that aren't secured by the company, the idea of bring your own device, people accessing email on their own personal cell phones, you have these devices that aren't secured by the company and use to access corporate data, and it's that much worse because that cache of data is now exists in a very physical realm that travels with the user, and it's now subject to thefts or mistakes in that realm. So the idea of leaving their phone in the car, being stolen as part of a purse picked up from a restaurant table when the owner's back is turned, it just becomes that much more difficult. So we have this idea that users aren't very careful with their information, aren't very careful with their personal devices, and then naturally the idea of a password. These things are supposed to secure accounts, things are supposed to secure company data. They don't treat their credentials with proper care. Most of the time, people will choose a very easy to remember password. We see it all the time. People have 4-digit pins on their phones, and they'll hit the same number 4 times, and then that's their password. So people are more apt to choose convenience over security, and this means easier to remember. Like I was saying, this means easy to remember but weak passwords standing between an attacker and their prize, and that prize is your data. So we're going to go ahead and open up a second poll, and I'll give it about 30 seconds, the same way I did with the last one. Has anyone in the room been through an attack, or maybe not a full-blown attack, but has anyone seen a threat manifest itself in their business? This could be an email coming through, even if you don't click on it. It could be a shady email. It could be a spoofed email where you've had to ask, like, hey, did you send this to me? Anything like that. That would absolutely count if you've seen it. So we're going to go ahead and we'll give it 30 seconds, and then I'll continue the discussion. Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll call that 30 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move to the next slide here and take a gander at the results. It looks like some of us in the room have experienced something like this in a current or a past role. And those of us that have experienced this, we are more than likely very aware of the losses that it caused the organization, the rebuilding time, the assets that were taken, among others. So we have this question that arises as we're getting into the idea of it's so easy to attack a business, the bar for entry is so low. So the question arises, why don't businesses have the security they need? And we see some common factors, some common themes here. And the nature of security in the cloud can be too complex. Most commonly, there is no dedicated IT team whose job it is to understand the vulnerabilities of the business and institute methods and policies to secure the organization, itself. So we have the idea is that not only is security too complex, but it's also too expensive. So we have this very complex, very expensive thing, and the expensive part is certainly in the complex part, but the expensive part is certainly a misconception. Most often, it just takes a minimal amount of effort or even a minimal amount of dollars to deter all but the most determined attackers to move them on to the next target. Because of this, what we've determined, because it is easy, because it is relatively cheap, just to get something in place, anything in place, the underlying cause of why businesses don't have the security they need is the "it can't happen to me" mentality running rampant in the business space and business world. And because of that, it leads to security not being a business priority. And when it's not a business priority, we find that people just aren't protected. And this leads, when there's no protection, this leads to just gigantic, gaping, critical security vulnerabilities. So getting into the idea of the common misconceptions and things like that, what we hear, we're going to start getting into some case studies and what we hear most based off of our experience with clients. The number one most common misconception that we hear is that Microsoft backs up all of my data. And why we hear it is that it's not entirely wrong. Microsoft does keep backups of your data, but these backups aren't to protect you. You don't have access to these backups. You can't call Microsoft and say, "Hey, I lost my entire mailbox. Do you have a copy?" They will say no. They're to protect Microsoft from you, meaning that they do not want you pointing the finger at them for lost data. If that would happen, that certainly wouldn't be a very good business model if they couldn't retain customer data. So in this case, what we review here, this case we're about to jump into, it didn't involve any malicious intent. It didn't involve any malware. It didn't involve any outside bad actors. It didn't involve anyone with, again, any kind of malicious intent, and it ended up resulting in permanent data loss for a user who'd been at the company for years. So we have an employee who went on maternity leave, and the in-house Office 365 administrator, hoping to save the company money, I'm sure, removed the Office 365 license from the user at the start of her leave. Naturally, maternity leave tends to last more than 30 days. So at the end of her maternity leave, she did, in fact, rejoin the company and was hoping to get to work. So what ended up happening was, because the license had been unassigned for more than 30 days, Microsoft deletes data from accounts that have been unlicensed for more than 30 days. So what ends up happening is that, this user, the in-house Office 365 admin reassigns the license account, gives the person access to their emails, and they come back to an empty mailbox. And there's no way to recover those emails, to recover those lost messages. They are just lost permanently. This could have been avoided. There are several methods that can be used to archive user data in case of temporary or permanent departure from the company. So we can go ahead and get into common misconception number 2. We see this quite a bit as well. And it's a common question that we get, whereas common misconception number 1 is very much a statement, this confidence of, like, Microsoft backs up all my data. This one's much more of a question, and it is a why is there a need for additional spam protection in Office 365? And the answer is quite simple, and it's because attackers themselves are getting much more clever. The basic Office 365 spam protection is fine for protecting against generic spam. Using tools like the whitelist and blacklist are great for cutting down on known traffic and known malicious domains. And again, the existing tools are great for cutting down on obvious things like malicious files and emails, things like executable files being attached and sent to people within your organization. But what we find is if there's just a few minutes of effort put in to these messages, it's often clever enough to bypass basic spam filtering across all platforms. So what we ended up having happen was we had a VIP account with one of our customers that was spoofed. And a spoofed mailbox is when someone from outside the company was sending emails into the company, and they were able to obscure or manipulate the from field to make it appear as though it's a VIP within the company. So the accounts themselves were secure. No one had any passwords. These emails, again, were not coming from within the company. It was a user from outside the company sending email in. So the user, the recipient, was told to transfer a sum of money to an account that wasn't affiliated with the company, and they simply complied with this email's request because it was purported to be from a VIP within the company. And the money was lost irretrievably, and very much suddenly. This could have been avoided. Again, there are just a couple methods that I can just touch on briefly. The idea of a DMARC record having been in place would have prevented a spoofing attack entirely. Additionally, advanced threat protection would have caught this. This was a more targeted spam attack because of what advanced threat protection actually does. It'll actually stage the email. It'll stage the email before it hits your inbox and continually all check messages in your mailbox that contain links and attachments for malicious intent. So what we see is these email messages coming in. They're totally innocuous. They bypass the spam filter. And then after they've sat in your email for 5 or 6 minutes, the endpoint for the link will be changed. And with advanced threat protection in place, it will actually pick up on that and it'll remove the mail. You won't be able to click the link in the mailbox at all. So it removes all threats, incoming and current. So we can go ahead and we're just going to go ahead and roll into the next poll because we've covered the idea of advanced threat protection and how beneficial it can be against just any kind of clever spam or generic spam, anything like that. So are you using any kind of advanced threat protection? And what we find, we qualify in this case advanced threat protection as any sort of additional services that's in play on top of Office 365. You'll know if you have it, and if you don't know if you have it or not, you probably don't. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to give this 30 seconds, and then we'll roll into the next slide after I review the results. All right, we're going to go ahead and we'll call that 30 seconds. If anyone has any last minute replies they want to jump in on, please just go ahead and get that punched in now. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and we'll move on to the next portion. Let me review the results here real quick. So looking at the results here, it doesn't appear that a lot of people have advanced threat protection. So the case that we're going to cover now is that the idea of the default account security in Office 365, or just the idea of a password across all platforms, is enough. this case that we're getting ready to summarize was a direct result of weak passwords being compromised in order to gain admin level access to the Office 365 tenants. So IOTAP noticed strange emails being sent from client accounts, and we did some investigations, and we actually found that the emails were actually being sent from within the company itself. This wasn't like case study number 2. This wasn't a malicious actor acting from outside the company sending emails in. This was someone who had actually gained access to the mailboxes within the Office 365 tenant and was actually sending out spam messages. So we continued to investigate, and we noticed a global admin account that was created on the tenant that no one had any recollection of creating, and it was made to look like a VIP within the company. So the only way that this can happen is if there's access to an administrator account, and then that administrator account creates another administrator account on the Office 365 tenant. So we know that this was because of passwords being reused, or an old unsecure password being compromised from another data breach on the internet. So more than likely what has happened, and we're fairly confident in this, is that the password was leaked as part of another data breach on the internet, and it was recycled into Office 365 with the intent of securing the account, and obviously it didn't. This could have been fixed with a simple password expiration policy, or MFA, which we will get into. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into now the best practices. We've gone out of our way to point out these common misconceptions, these common security concerns in Office 365, and I'm just going to go ahead and go into the best practices, and we'll work on wrapping up here after I summarize this. So passwords themselves are often made useless by user choice. We recommend the use of a password safe like LastPass, which has password creation capabilities built in, meaning that the users themselves aren't tasked with coming up with passwords. They're not going to have the tendency to reuse passwords, recycle passwords from account to account, and that's going to make them more secure. Every password on an account should be unique to it. The next thing that we recommend is, and MFA ties hand in hand to this, is that administrator accounts on Office 365 shouldn't be tied to day-to-day activities. No one should be replying to emails out of their administrator account, anything like that. We recommend that there's a separate administrator account. And on the administrator account, we recommend that multi-factor authentication be implemented for the administrator accounts, and really the VIPs at the very least. MFA in Office 365 is included with some plans. And it's very simple to implement, and it's very simple to use. All it does is it just sends a text message to your phone saying, hey, punch in this code, and then you're off to the races. And then obviously anyone who'd want to get in, they can have your password, but if they don't have your phone number, they're not going to be able to get in. So again, things like filing a DMARC record to prevent probably what's commonly the second most common sort of cyber attack, the idea of filing a DMARC record with a DNS registrar, it will totally prevent any kind of spoofing originating from outside the organization. People will simply just not be able to impersonate accounts with that DMARC record in place. And then the last thing, you have all this protection in place. You have your MFA, you have your DMARC record, you have your separate admin accounts, you have your password safe. The next thing that we really, really recommend is taking regular backups of your cloud data, your OneDrive, your SharePoint, your mailboxes, preferably to a recovery target located outside of the Office 365 tenant entirely. So if something happens, your data is located outside the Office 365 tenant, it's its own separate thing, you can restore from there. So we want to help you with all of this. IOTAP wants to help you with everything. If your business is secure, it not only benefits you, but it benefits us as well. Reach out to us, reach out to me even, and we're more than happy to sit with you to see the easiest and most effective methods by which we can add peace of mind to your company. Again, separating your admin accounts, talking about data backup, implementing multi-factor authentication. We're happy to do whatever it takes. We have a few minutes before we run out of time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And just as we go through this, reach out to me directly at cloud@iotap.com and just put the email in the subject line, I want my security assessment. So we'll give it a few minutes for any questions, and if there are no questions, or if there are some questions that need answering, we'll go ahead and answer them, and then otherwise we are going to wrap up. We are going to make these recordings available down the road, so keep an eye out for them. And if you have any questions, again, reach out to me at cloud@iotap.com or nohara@iotap.com, and we can get a security assessment rolling. Again, if there are any questions here, we can go ahead and pose them here. We'll get them answered. And if not, we'll give it a minute or so, and we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Hey, Nick, we'll just wrap up here. I'm going to close
Okay.
the session for everybody now. Thank you.
Thank you.